Alaska has a way of swallowing things without leaving marks. Planes go down and are never found. Rivers change course overnight. Entire valleys fill with fog that never lifts. Over 32 years as a state trooper, I learned that the most dangerous assumption you can make up here is that the map is telling the truth. Maps lie. Coordinates drift. Some places don't stay where you leave them. We used to joke about it at the barracks. Towns that fell off the edge. A hunting cabin someone swore existed, but no one could ever reach again. A mining camp that showed up on aerial surveys for one season, then vanished like a printing error. Officially, these were mistakes, bad data, human error. Unofficially, we called them missing places. I kept a private list. Dates, coordinates, witness names. I told myself it was just habit, a way to stay sharp. But the list grew too long, and the patterns got harder to ignore. Most of the disappearances clustered in the interior, where the cold sinks deep enough to preserve anything it touches, where the ground never truly thaws. I started to notice something else. People who stumbled into these places didn't come back the same, if they came back at all. They talked slower, remembered things out of order, like part of them stayed behind, locked to a moment that refused to move on. I didn't know it then, but those places weren't missing. They were waiting. The call came in just after dusk, when the sky over the interior turns the color of old bruises. Dispatch flagged it as a mayday from a private bush plane. Tail number registered to Tom Reeves, experienced, cautious, the kind of pilot who didn't panic easily. His voice on the recording was steady at first, clipped and professional, reporting engine failure and a forced landing. Then something shifted. He said he was down safely, said he could see lights ahead. A village. That was the first red flag. There was nothing on the charts within 100 miles of his last known position. No settlements, no seasonal camps, not even abandoned infrastructure. Dispatch asked him to confirm coordinates. He hesitated, like he was reading numbers off something that kept changing. Tom described houses, a main road, power on every building. He kept repeating one detail that no one asked about: the quiet. No wind, no dogs, no generators, just lights humming in the cold. Then his tone dropped. He said the people were watching him land, standing too still, too close together. When asked if he could see vehicles or snow machines, he said no. When asked about cell service, he laughed once, short and dry, like he'd just understood a bad joke. His last transmission came through warped, stretched thin by static. "Trooper, I don't think this place knows what year it is, and I don't think it wants me leaving." The line went dead. I reached the coordinates just after sunrise on February 15th. The storm cleared too fast, like something had pushed it aside for me. The valley opened up suddenly, and there it was, a village sitting clean and deliberate against the snow, untouched by weather or time. Roads plowed, roofs intact, smoke rising from chimneys in thin, polite lines. A hand-painted sign stood at the entrance: Hilford, Pop 43. The lettering was neat, careful, the kind you don't see anymore. My radio crackled the moment I crossed the tree line, dissolving into low static that pulsed like breathing. The buildings were wrong in a subtle way, too symmetrical, too preserved. Wooden storefronts with glass unclouded by age. A diner with chrome trim that reflected my patrol lights like it had been polished that morning. Every window glowed warm yellow, but I couldn't see movement inside. It felt staged, like a town built for someone else to arrive. I parked near the town hall. My boots sounded too loud on the street. No snow machines, no tracks, no wind. Just that hum, faint, electrical, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The doors to the hall were unlocked. Inside, The air smelled faintly of dust and cold iron. That's where I saw them. Tom Reeves first, sitting stiffly in a chair, staring at his hands like he didn't recognize them. Then the others, lined along the walls, smiling with mouths that knew the shape, but not the meaning. When they turned to look at me, I understood something immediately. I hadn't arrived at Hilford. I had been accepted. Hilford felt wrong the longer I stood in it, like a photograph you stare at long enough to notice something missing. The people moved, but without urgency. Every gesture was careful, rehearsed, as if they were afraid of stepping outside an invisible boundary. Men wore wool coats buttoned high, women dresses cut from another decade. Not costumes. Habits. The kind of clothing you forget you're wearing because it has always been that way. I checked my watch. The second hand dragged, stuttering once before catching up. My phone had no signal, not even a flicker. The air itself seemed thicker, pressing against my ears, muting distant sound. I realized then there were no birds, no wind through the trees. The town existed in a pocket of silence so complete it felt enforced. Inside the diner, coffee steamed in porcelain cups that hadn't chipped in 70 years. A jukebox hummed softly, without playing a song. The calendar on the wall read March 1952, pages yellowed but unturned. I asked a woman behind the counter what year it was. She smiled, too quickly, and said, "Why? It's always been 1952, officer." That was when it hit me. This place wasn't pretending. It wasn't preserved, or abandoned, or forgotten. Hilford was continuing, and everything outside it was what had changed. I started noticing the eyes first. Not right away. At first it was just a feeling. The sense of being watched too closely, too patiently. Conversations lagged by half a second, like they were waiting for something behind my words. When I spoke, people leaned in, not out of interest, but alignment, as if my voice needed to match the rhythm of the town. They didn't blink. Not when I met their gaze. Not when snow fell into their eyes outside. Their pupils were slightly dilated, swallowing more light than they should, reflecting it back dull and flat. When they smiled, it reached their mouths but stopped short of the eyes, which remained fixed and measuring. I tested it. I waved a hand suddenly in front of a man standing near the post office. He didn't flinch, just turned his head in one smooth motion, tracking my movement perfectly. No reflex, no irritation. Like a camera panning, up close. Their skin felt cold, not from the weather, but from something deeper, as if warmth was an optional setting they'd turned down long ago. When I asked questions, they answered politely, vaguely, never volunteering more than necessary. Names repeated, phrases recycled. I heard the same sentences come from different mouths, word for word, hours apart. That's when I realized they weren't watching me. They were waiting for me to stop being new. Mayor William Thornton explained it to me in the town hall, his voice calm, practiced, like a man reciting a pledge he'd learned as a boy. He said Hilford was built by people who were tired of watching everything rot. Bodies, buildings, memories. In 1952, they found something beneath the permafrost while digging a root cellar. Not an object, a presence, vast enough that language slid off it. It was old when the ground was young. It slept because the world had grown too loud, too fast, too governed by rules. But it still listened, and it made offers. Hilford would be preserved. No decay, no progression, no death as long as the town remained exactly as it was. In return, the town would anchor the thing's sleep, holding reality still above it like a lid. Time would pass around Hilford, but never through it. I asked about the cost. Thornton paused, just long enough to matter. Time has to come from somewhere. He led me to the walls. I saw them clearly then, shapes beneath the paint, faces stretched thin, mouths frozen open. People who arrived from outside and refused to let go of their own time. They were fed into the structure of the town, bled slowly of motion and memory, turned into support beams for the present. Hilford didn't kill them. It used them. And now, Thornton said softly, the town was hungry again. Once you know what to look for, you can't stop seeing it. The walls of Hilford weren't smooth. They rippled faintly, like skin under thin cloth. When the building settled, I heard it, not a crack or a groan, but a soft exhale, slow and tired. The sound followed me down the hallway, rising and falling in uneven rhythm. I pressed my palm against the plaster. It was warm, not room temperature, body warm. The surface yielded slightly, then pushed back, as if something on the other side had shifted its weight. I pulled my hand away and found a smear of condensation shaped like fingers that weren't mine, somewhere inside the wall. Something scraped once, desperate and weak. Thornton told me not to worry, said the town was well supported. I noticed faces only when the light hit them right. Cheekbones, eyelids, teeth just beneath the paint, stretched so thin it had turned translucent. Some mouths were open wide enough to suggest screaming, but no sound escaped them. Their eyes followed me, slowly, patiently. They weren't dead. That was the worst part. I could feel it in the air, thick with stale breath and trapped warmth. Every building in Hilford was reinforced with people who had arrived too late and refused to belong. The town wasn't built on concrete and timber. It was built on resistance, and it was still drawing strength from them, one shallow breath at a time. Tom Reeves sat in the same chair every time I saw him, like the town had decided that was where he belonged. At first I thought it was shock. He answered when spoken to, nodded at the right moments, tried to joke once or twice, but something was slipping. Slow and quiet. His sentences shortened. His memories arrived out of order. He asked me what year it was, 3 times in an hour. When I told him, he frowned, like he was doing the math and not liking the answer. His watch had stopped, the second hand frozen between ticks. He kept twisting his wrist, tapping the glass, insisting it had been working earlier. It just needs to catch up, he said. Everything here does. I watched his reflection in a window as we talked. It lagged behind his movements by a fraction of a second. When he smiled, the reflection followed late, stretching the expression too far before settling. He didn't notice. The townspeople had started treating him differently, standing closer, speaking slower, clearer, like correcting a child. A woman adjusted his coat collar without asking, her fingers lingering too long, as if measuring him for a fit. Tom told me he was tired, bone tired, said the cold felt different now, less sharp, more distant. When I asked what he meant, he looked confused, then scared. I can't feel the minutes anymore, he whispered. That's when I understood. Hilford wasn't killing him. It was sinking him, and once it finished, there would be nothing left to pull back. The truth settled in pieces. Not all at once. A missing face in the wall where there had been 2 the day before. The lights growing brighter as Tom grew quieter. The way the town seemed to straighten itself when I entered a room, like it was bracing, drawing something from me. I realized then that Hilford wasn't sustained by time alone. It fed on refusal, on the friction between what was and what shouldn't be here. Thornton didn't deny it when I confronted him. He just looked relieved, like I'd finally said the word he'd been waiting on. Outsiders arrived carrying their own momentum, their own years. That motion was valuable. It could be siphoned, slowed, redistributed. Those who accepted the town were eased gently into alignment. Those who didn't were repurposed. Fuel burns whether it agrees or not. I felt it start when my thoughts began looping. Small things at first. Checking my watch too often. Forgetting why I'd entered a room. The walls pulsed faintly when I stood still too long, responding to my presence like muscle to strain. Hilford was tasting me, testing how much resistance I had left. That's when panic finally cut through the fog. We weren't prisoners waiting to be killed. We were resources being processed. And once the town decided you were useful, escape stopped being a concept that made sense. I knew I didn't have much time once I felt the town start pushing back. The longer I stayed still, the heavier the air became, like gravity was being adjusted locally. My thoughts dulled at the edges. I caught myself standing in the middle of the street, unsure how long I'd been there, watching the lights glow a little brighter with every shallow breath I took. That's when I remembered the satellite phone. It felt obscene pulling it out, like introducing a foreign object into a closed system. The screen flickered as soon as it powered on, struggling to display the date, FEB 15, 2021, as if the numbers themselves were under dispute. The moment it acquired a signal, the town reacted. A low vibration rolled through the ground. Windows rattled. Somewhere deep beneath the streets, something shifted. I activated the emergency beacon. The sound was barely audible, a thin electronic chirp repeating at precise intervals. But Hilford heard it. The lights dimmed, then surged. The hum in the air rose to a pitch that made my teeth ache. People stepped out of buildings, their heads turning in perfect unison toward the source of the noise. The beacon wasn't calling for help. It was dragging the present into a place that had no defenses against it. For the first time since I arrived, the town felt afraid. The reaction was immediate and violent. The street buckled as if something beneath it had convulsed. Buildings flickered, not in light, but in age. Paint peeled and restored itself in the same second. Wood darkened, then brightened. Grain rewinding and fast-forwarding in uneven bursts. I watched a storefront window craze with cracks, shatter, then pull itself back together. Glass flowing upward like liquid memory. People screamed, but the sounds overlapped wrong. Voices echoing before the mouths opened. Laughter bleeding into sobs. Words arriving seconds late, or not at all. Some of them aged in front of me. Lines carved into faces, then smoothed away. Hair went gray, then snapped back to black. A man fell to his knees, hands clutching his chest as his body tried to decide which decade it belonged to. The sky fractured next. Clouds slid backward against the wind, then froze. Snow hung suspended, each flake vibrating in place. My radio spat out voices that weren't mine, dispatch calls from years apart, layered and fighting for priority. I felt it too. Memories surfaced that weren't mine, or were mine, but hadn't happened yet. My name sounded unfamiliar in my own head. The beacon kept chirping, steady and merciless, a metronome forcing time back into rhythm. Hilford had been built to stop time. Now time was pushing back, and it was angry. The ground split with a sound like a held breath finally released. The street collapsed inward, folding down into a widening scar that cut through the center of town. Cold poured out of it, not wind, not air, but something heavier, absolute, stripping heat from everything it touched. Frost raced across the buildings in branching patterns, sealing doors and windows shut like lids on coffins. Then the ice moved. At first I thought it was just the earth heaving, pressure equalizing after the collapse. But the shape kept rising, deliberate, forcing its way upward through centuries of frozen ground. A hand emerged, vast, misshapen, built from shadow and permafrost. Fingers unfolded slowly, joints grinding like glaciers calving. Each movement warped the space around it. Bending distance, swallowing perspective. The town screamed as one. Walls ruptured, faces trapped inside them stretched and tore free, dissolving into frost and ash. Hilford wasn't being destroyed. It was being released. Mayor Thornton stood at the edge of the lie, his face finally alive with terror. He looked at me once, eyes wide and wet. "We were never meant to hold it forever," he said. "We were only buying time." The hand clenched. The valley imploded. Snow. Buildings. People. Everything folded inward, erased in a blink. I felt myself thrown backward, weightless. As the place that should not have existed finished collapsing into nothing. Behind me, the beacon chirped one last time. Then Hilford was gone. I came to lying face down in the snow, my lungs burning like I'd been underwater too long. The valley was gone. Not ruined. Not buried. Absent. Where Hilford had been was a smooth, empty basin, untouched by tracks, buildings, or debris, like the land had never learned the idea of a town. Tom was alive. Barely. He kept asking me why it was dark when we'd arrived at dawn. My watch answered before I did. The date read February 18th, 2021. At first I thought it was damaged. I checked my phone. Then the emergency beacon's log. Same result. 3 days of timestamps I didn't remember living through. Search aircraft had already been launched, reports filed, my name listed as missing, then recovered. Inside Hilford. I'd tracked everything out of habit. 3 hours, 17 minutes. I was certain of it. I could still feel the weight of those minutes in my bones, compacted and dense, like something folded too tightly. Tom was worse. He drifted in and out, muttering about conversations we hadn't had yet. He asked me if we'd already escaped, then nodded when I said yes, like I'd confirmed a suspicion instead of delivering news. That's when it hit me. Time hadn't just stretched, it had skipped, and whatever we'd left behind hadn't gone back to sleep when the town collapsed. They reached us before my own department did. 2 black helicopters cut through the low clouds, unmarked, too quiet for their size. The men who stepped out didn't ask questions. They already had answers. They separated Tom and me, wrapped us in thermal blankets, and took our statements in a tone that suggested the words didn't matter nearly as much as the inconsistencies between them. I noticed the patch on the woman's jacket when she finally introduced herself. Sarah Hriss, FBI. No unit listed, no insignia I recognized. She spoke carefully, choosing each word like it might echo later. She told me Hilford did not exist, had never existed. Satellite passes from the last 20 years showed nothing but empty wilderness where the town should have been. Then she slid a tablet across the table. The image showed a perfect circular depression in the valley floor, darker than the surrounding snow. The temperature reading blinked at the bottom of the screen, numbers hovering just above absolute zero. "That appeared 3 days ago," she said, "at the exact moment your beacon activated." I asked what unit she was really with. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked how well I remembered my own name while I was inside the town, whether my memories felt stable now, or provisional. Before she left, Chris paused at the door. "You didn't just survive something impossible," she said. "You stayed yourself inside it. That makes you rare." That was the first time I realized this wasn't over. It was recruitment. They moved me to a temporary site, outside Fairbanks, a place that didn't officially exist and never stayed in the same location 2 nights in a row. That's where Hriss told me the truth. Hilford wasn't a glitch or a singular event. It was a category, an impossible place, a location that violated continuity but remained stable enough to be observed. Alaska had more of them than anywhere else on the planet. She showed me files, villages that appeared for decades, then erased themselves overnight. Roads that led somewhere different each time they were driven. Settlements recorded in census data, but missing from every map that followed. The pattern was always the same: isolation, preservation, and a cost paid by anyone who crossed the boundary uninvited. These places aren't accidents, Chris said. They're structures, seals. She explained that something old lay beneath them. Things that predated physics, waiting in layers below reality. The towns were pressure points, designed to hold the rules in place by sacrificing time, memory, and people who didn't belong. Hilford had failed, and when it did, the strain didn't disappear, it redistributed. That was the part that mattered. Satellite data showed subtle changes across the state, temperature anomalies, time discrepancies measured in nanoseconds, but spreading. Reality thinning, like ice in early spring. You broke the first seal, Chris said quietly. Now the rest know it's possible. I asked why tell me any of this. She closed the file and looked at me hard. Because you're already inside the system, she said, and it hasn't managed to rewrite you yet. That's when I understood. Imbuturos. Possible places weren't disappearing. They were waking up. Dr. Marcus Webb explained it without mythology, which somehow made it worse. He said the universe hadn't always obeyed rules. Physics, causality, time, those were late additions. Layered on once reality learned how to stabilize itself. Before that, existence was loose, fluid, governed by entities that didn't experience sequence the way we do. He called them pre-causal intelligences. I called them what they felt like, rulers. According to Webb, these beings didn't invade or arrive. They were already here when the universe hardened around them, trapped beneath newer laws like insects in amber. Alaska, with its vast emptiness and geologic violence, sat thinner than most places. The ground remembered older instructions. The cold helped preserve them. The seals weren't prisons in the traditional sense. They were compromises. Towns, camps, and settlements positioned above these intelligences to anchor reality locally, to keep the old rules buried under routine, repetition, and human time. As long as things stayed predictable, days passing, people aging, histories moving forward, the deeper layers stayed asleep. Hilford had been especially effective because it cheated. By locking itself to a single year, it stopped feeding entropy downward. It held the weight. When it collapsed, that pressure didn't vanish. It rippled outward. Webb showed me graphs tracking micro-failures across the state. Spikes where equations stopped balancing. Moments where cause arrived after effect. The old rulers don't want conquest, he said. They want relevance. They're waiting for the universe to loosen again. I thought of the hand beneath the ice. Waiting didn't mean passive. It meant patient. Once you know what to look for. The failures announce themselves quietly. A fishing village, where the tide arrives an hour early and leaves behind footprints that don't belong to anyone alive. A logging camp that keeps repeating the same winter, the same snowfall, the same deaths, as if stuck on a damaged reel. These weren't disasters yet. They were stress fractures. Webb and I traveled by bush plane and snow machine, following reports no one else wanted, missing census workers, radio calls that looped, satellite images that disagreed with themselves. In Forgotten Harbor, the docks were still warm despite the air being 40 below. In Perpetual Claim, miners swore they'd been underground for 3 days. Our instruments said 9 minutes. Each village showed the same signs Hilford had before it fell. People preserving routines too carefully. Buildings resisting age. Time hesitating at the edges. And always something beneath, not visible, but felt a pressure, like standing over a deep shaft with no bottom. The seals were weakening in sequence. Webb tracked it with a grim satisfaction, plotting their decline like a disease curve. Hilford's collapse had synchronized the failures, dragging them closer together. The worst part was the people. They knew something was wrong, but not what. They clung harder to tradition, to habit, to repetition, feeding the seals without understanding the cost. Outsiders started going missing. Locals stopped asking where they'd gone. We weren't preventing collapse. We were cataloging it. And the time between failures was shrinking. Tom Reeves survived Hilford, but he didn't come back alone. Something followed him out. Not a thing you could point to, but a condition. He experienced time like overlapping transparencies, while the rest of us moved forward. Tom stood at the intersection, watching moments slide past each other out of order. He started finishing sentences before we spoke them, correcting people on things they hadn't said yet. At first, we thought it was trauma, the brain misfiring under stress. Then his predictions started lining up too cleanly to ignore. A supply helicopter delayed by 30 seconds because of a sudden crosswind that hadn't formed yet. A radio blackout that happened exactly when Tom said it would. Down to the second. He described it as seeing wakes instead of boats. Events left disturbances before they arrived. He could feel when reality was about to adjust itself, trimming inconsistencies like a bad edit. The closer we got to a failing seal, the worse it became. Tom would clutch his head, whispering about branches collapsing, about futures that couldn't coexist. One night outside Timber's End, he woke screaming and told us Anchorage was about to lose a piece of itself. 6 minutes, he said. No fire, no noise, just absence. It happened the next day. Tom stopped asking if he was going crazy after that. He knew what he was now. A warning system. A symptom. Proof that the seals weren't just breaking. They were bleeding into people. Reality's rewriting itself, he told me once, eyes unfocused, tracking something I couldn't see. And it's running out of margins. That's when I understood. Tom wasn't predicting the future. He was remembering versions that no longer existed. It happened at 14:26 local time on a clear Thursday, which is the only reason anyone believes it happened at all. Anchorage didn't explode. There was no sound, no warning sirens, no power surge. One moment the city was there, traffic inching along, planes lining up on approach. The next, a section of it simply wasn't. 6 square blocks vanished. Cars coasted forward and dropped into nothing, hitting air that behaved like solid ground until it didn't. A delivery truck stopped with its rear wheels still on asphalt and its front end hanging over an edge that hadn't existed a second earlier. Cell calls cut off mid-word. Security cameras recorded empty frames where buildings should have been, their feeds continuing like nothing was wrong. For 6 minutes, the city held its breath. People standing at the boundary described it differently. Some said it looked like fog. Others said heat shimmer. I saw the footage. It was worse than either. The space where the city should have been refused definition. Depth collapsed. Distance meant nothing. Looking at it too long made your eyes ache, like they were trying to focus on a thought instead of a place. Then it snapped back. Buildings reappeared intact. Cars slammed onto pavement that returned under them. People who had been mid-step stumbled and fell, disoriented, but alive. Only a handful never came back. Their absence was subtle, missing records, unanswered phones, apartments that felt unfinished. Tom had warned us. 6 minutes, no noise. Afterward, officials blamed a data error, a power fluctuation, anything measurable. But Anchorage didn't disappear. It was edited. And whatever was doing the editing had just proven it could reach into the present, remove a piece, and put it back wrong. After Anchorage, the failures stopped pretending to be isolated. Time began slipping its leash in small, humiliating ways. Traffic lights changed before timers reached zero. Security logs stamped events that hadn't happened yet. People showed up to meetings they later claimed they never attended, their signatures already on documents they hadn't signed. Webb called it desynchronization. Cause and effect were still connected, just not in the correct order. The margins that kept reality tidy were eroding. Everywhere, a seal weakened. Time bled outward, contaminating the surrounding area. It didn't break all at once. It frayed. I felt it personally. Some mornings I woke up already exhausted, like I'd lived the day once before. Conversations echoed in my head hours after they ended, sometimes before they began. Tom said that was normal now. "You're starting to hear the overlap," he told me. "That means it's close." Anchorage had been a test, a careful edit. After that, the corrections got sloppy. Objects aged overnight. Snow fell upward during one recorded storm. A rescue call came in from a woman reporting her husband missing, then called back 10 minutes later to say he'd just walked through the door. Confused, asking why she was crying. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the adjustment. People adapted too quickly, accepting contradictions if they resolved fast enough. Reality learned it could get away with less consistency. Time wasn't collapsing. It was improvising. And somewhere beneath Alaska, the old rulers were learning the new rules just well enough to start bending them back. The models stopped agreeing with each other first. Webb ran the simulations anyway, feeding them updated data until the margins vanished entirely. Every projection curved toward the same conclusion, no matter where it started. The seals weren't failing independently anymore. They were resonating, pulling each other closer to collapse like synchronized faults along a single fracture line. Webb put the timeline on the board and erased it twice before leaving it up. Best case, 18 months. Worst case, less than a year. After that, the corrections would overwhelm containment. The old ones wouldn't break reality. They'd inherit it, reshaping the loosened rules into something compatible with themselves. Tom confirmed it without numbers. He said the future had started thinning, that fewer versions were surviving past a certain point. When he looked ahead now, he saw endings stacked on top of each other, branches snapping back into a single trunk. "There used to be room," he told me. "Now it's narrowing." The FBI called it a convergence event, a deadline where choice stopped mattering because there wouldn't be enough structure left to support it. Humanity would still exist, technically, just not in control of the frame it lived in. That's when Webb proposed the unthinkable. One last seal. Not a town, not a village. Something bigger, stronger. A lock that could hold even if everything else failed. The room went quiet when he finished. No one argued with the math. We argued with what it would cost. Because, for the first time, the question wasn't how to stop the end. It was what we were willing to sacrifice so it wouldn't be ours. Webb laid it out like a disaster response plan, which was the only way any of us could listen to it without walking out. Alaska already sat thin, vast, sparsely populated, a natural boundary. If a single town could anchor a seal, then an entire state, locked into a controlled temporal loop, could do more than delay collapse. It could contain it. The proposal was simple in structure and monstrous in implication. Time in Alaska would be stabilized at a fixed interval, looping endlessly within a narrow range. Days would repeat with minor variation. No forward drift, no decay for the deeper layers to exploit. The old ones would remain awake beneath us, but boxed in by a reality that refused to progress. 4 million people would live the same days forever. They wouldn't know it, not consciously. Memory would reset. Experience would blur. From the inside, life would feel continuous, imperfectly human. From the outside, Alaska would become a static mass, a frozen buffer between what the universe had become and what it was trying to remember how to be. Webb didn't sugarcoat it. There would be no rescue later, no rollback. Once enacted, the seal would have to hold indefinitely. Alaska would be removed from the future so the rest of the world could keep one. I thought of the villages we'd seen, people clinging to routine, repeating habits until they hardened into walls. We'd judged them for their bargains. Now we were considering making the same one at scale. The silence after Webb finished was heavy, absolute. Freezing Alaska would save humanity. It would just cost us the right to move forward with it. No one said yes out loud. No one had to. The room filled with the quiet arithmetic of sacrifice. Every person measuring numbers against faces they knew. 4 million lives, flattened into a function. Infinite repetition in exchange for continuity everywhere else. Webb talked about stability margins and containment probabilities, but his voice kept cracking around the edges, like the words were rejecting him. I watched the others retreat into abstraction. Someone asked whether people inside the loop would suffer. Another asked if suffering required memory. The answers came back clean, technical, wrong in a way that felt deliberate. We weren't debating cruelty. We were negotiating permission. Tom broke the silence. He said the futures past that point all tasted the same. Gray, compressed. Alaska didn't scream in them. It just went quiet, like a held breath that never released. It works, he admitted. That's the worst part. It works almost every time. Almost. That word hung there. Poisonous. I realized then that the collapse had already happened. Just not in the ground or the sequel sky. It was happening in us. We'd moved from asking if we should do this to asking how. The moment that shift occurred, something essential gave way. I thought about Hilford, about the people in the walls, about how convinced they'd been that permanence justified anything. We told ourselves this was different, larger, necessary. That's how every seal justifies itself right before it fails. By the time the meeting ended, no vote had been taken, no orders signed. But the decision was already there, settled and cold. We were ready to freeze an entire state. All we needed was someone willing to pull the trigger. Tom found me outside the facility, staring at the dark like it might offer alternatives. He didn't waste time easing into it. He said we were wrong about the shape of the problem. The seals weren't barriers holding something back. They were choices made permanent, mistakes given structure. Freezing Alaska would work. Yes, but only by repeating the original sin at a scale that would echo forever. The last seal isn't land, he said. It's decision. He told me the future wasn't branching anymore because it had reached a narrowing point, a place where intent mattered more than action. Every version where Alaska was frozen survived. Every version where the old ones were released outright burned. But there were gaps between those outcomes. Thin, unstable paths most people never saw because they required contradiction. Tom said he'd finally understood why Hilford had failed. Not because the bargain was too small, but because it tried to end choice. The moment the town locked itself to 1 year, it stopped participating in reality. It became brittle. A real seal has to choose every moment, he said. Over and over, it has to hurt. That's when I felt it click into place, heavy and unavoidable. We'd been searching for a structure when what we needed was a witness, a constant act of refusal, something that could exist across timelines without settling into one. I asked him why he was telling me this. Tom looked at me with tired certainty. Because every future where this works, he said, has you standing at the center of it, not as a commander, not as a sacrifice. He swallowed. As the line, and for the first time since Hilford, I understood that the worst bargains aren't the ones forced on you. They're the ones only you can accept. The cabin was already there when I arrived, crouched in a clearing that didn't exist on any map I'd ever used. No tracks led to it. No smoke from the chimney. It felt less like finding a place and more like stepping into a thought that had been waiting for me to finish it. Inside. The air smelled of old wood and gun oil. I wasn't alone. They stood and sat and leaned against the walls. Dozens of men wearing my face, my posture, my injuries. Some were younger, eyes sharper, hands steadier. Others were worn down, scarred in ways I didn't recognize yet. A few looked hollow, like they'd already made a decision and lost something essential because of it. None of them spoke at first. They just watched me the way I'd watched suspects in interview rooms, reading micro-movements, waiting for the truth to surface on its own. I understood without being told. These were versions of me that had reached this point from different paths. Some had failed. Some had chosen wrong. Some were still deciding. On the table between us lay two objects, a revolver, heavy and final, and an old metal key worn smooth from use across hands that were all mine. One of the older versions finally met my eyes and nodded once, grim and respectful. "This is where it narrows," he said. "After this, there aren't many of us left." I felt the weight of every choice I'd ever made pressing inward, compressing me toward this moment. The seventh seal wasn't waiting out there. It was waiting in here. And every version of me already knew what was at stake. No one explained the rules. They didn't need to. I understood them the way you understand gravity, by the quiet certainty that stepping wrong would end everything below you. The gun was simple. End all of us at once. A paradox tight enough to snap shut, collapsing Alaska into a permanent temporal prison. No future. No release. The world saved by subtraction. The key was worse. It would open what the seals had been holding back. Let the old ones rise fully into relevance. Humanity would adapt or break. Progress would continue. But under rules we didn't write and couldn't fully understand. I picked up the gun first. It felt familiar, weighted by muscle memory and consequence. Some versions of me flinched. Others nodded, already knowing how that path ended. I saw flashes then, Alaska frozen mid-breath. 4 million lives looping in perfect ignorance. Peaceful, clean, wrong. I set the gun down and touched the key. It was warm, vibrating faintly, like it existed slightly ahead of my hand. Futures rushed up around it, cities warped but alive. History rewritten, but moving forward. Survival without dominance. Existence without permission. Neither choice was mercy. Both were control. That's when I realized the trap. The cabin wasn't asking me to decide the world's fate. It was asking me to stop deciding at once. Every version of me in that room had failed by choosing an ending. Gun or key, lock or release. Final answers. I stepped back from the table, heart pounding, and understood the real question wasn't which object I would take. It was whether I was willing to keep choosing forever, and whether I could live with never being finished. I told them both answers were wrong. The gun ended choice. The key surrendered it. Either way, the future became something decided, fixed, brittle. That was how SEALs failed, by mistaking permanence for strength. I said the system didn't need another lock. It needed a hinge. They looked at me like I was stalling, like every other version who'd tried to invent mercy at the last second. So I explained it as simply as I could. Alaska wouldn't be frozen. and the old ones wouldn't be unleashed. Alaska would become a border, a place where rules were enforced not by structure, but by attention, by refusal renewed every moment. The seal wouldn't be a town, or a state, or a machine. It would be me, not my body, not my lifespan, my continuation. I would exist across timelines, anchored to the choice itself, maintaining the boundary by eternally choosing to maintain it. The old ones could wake and rule their domain, but no farther. Humanity would keep the rest, not by dominance, but by distance. Some of the versions laughed, some looked relieved. One of them was already fading, like he'd been waiting to hear it before letting go. I felt the cabin loosen around me, possibilities realigning. The gun and key dulled, losing definition. They weren't needed anymore. I didn't step forward or back. I stayed. The moment stretched, then split, then layered. I felt myself unfold across versions, awareness thinning and expanding at once. Pain, clarity, exhaustion, resolve, all of it braided together. I became the act of choosing, not once, not finally, but forever. And as the cabin dissolved into everywhere and nowhere, I understood the cost. The world would move on, and I would never leave this moment again. There was no transformation the way movies promise, no light, no sudden understanding. It happened quietly, like frost forming when you're not watching. One moment I was still thinking in sequence, before and after, and the next those words stopped meaning what they used to. I didn't step into the border. I realized I had always been standing on it. Alaska didn't freeze. It clarified. Lines sharpened. The pressure I'd felt beneath the ground resolved into a constant, contained weight. The old ones woke, but not all at once, not fully. They pressed against the boundary and found resistance that wasn't force, but presence. Me, paying attention. I existed in overlap, in the cabin and outside it, in first snow and last thaw. Every time the boundary weakened, I felt it like strain in a muscle, and I chose again. Not with words, with continuity, with refusal to let one side overwrite the other. Time resumed its forward motion everywhere else. Cities breathed, histories diverged, humanity kept its momentum, unaware of how close it had come to being edited out entirely. Alaska became something undefined on purpose, a margin, a warning, a buffer no map could agree on. I don't age the way I should. I don't die. Versions of me persist across moments that should cancel each other out, all anchored to the same responsibility. When reality leans too far, I lean back. This is what the seal was always meant to be. Not a wall, a line held by someone who never stops watching. And as long as I remain here, choosing without end, the world stays on its side of the border. Alaska still exists on maps, but not the way it used to. Airlines fly around certain corridors without knowing why. GPS systems disagree near the interior, nudging routes east or west to fractions that feel intentional. People talk about the state like it's a single thing, but I feel it as layers, overlapping permissions held in tension. From the outside, Alaska became quiet in the data, fewer anomalies, fewer questions. From the inside, life went on, mostly unchanged. Towns aged, kids grew up, winters came and went. The border didn't announce itself. It corrected gently, editing extremes before they could harden into events. When something presses too hard from below, I feel it ripple through weather, through geology, through chance. A storm breaks early. A road washes out. A flight delays just long enough to avoid a crossing that shouldn't happen yet. To people, it looks like bad luck or Alaska being Alaska. That's the point. The old ones learned their limits. They occupy their domain. Deep time. Deep cold. The vast interior layers where human meaning thins out. They don't rule the world. They rule here. And even that rule is negotiated. Moment by moment. Against my attention. Alaska is no longer a place you simply enter. It's a condition. A gradient between what is allowed and what is not. Most people pass through without noticing the weight shift. Some feel it and leave. A rare few stop and listen. Those are the ones I watch closely. Because Alaska isn't a prison. It's a conversation that never ends. And as long as it stays unfinished, the rest of the world gets to keep moving forward. I don't measure time anymore. It passes through me instead, leaving impressions like weather on stone. I feel anniversaries without dates, crises without headlines, when reality leans too hard toward collapse. I sense it the way you sense a change in pressure before a storm. That's when I tighten my grip, not with force, but with presence. The old ones test the boundary constantly, not with violence, with patience. They push ideas upward, subtle edits, suggestions that the rules might bend if no one is watching. I watch. I always watch. Every incursion is answered the same way. Not denied, not allowed, but contained. Alaska absorbs what the rest of the world cannot afford to understand yet. I exist in countless moments at once, but I'm never finished in any of them. There is no relief, no closure waiting at the end of this role. The price of being the border is permanence, without rest. I don't sleep. I don't forget. I don't get to believe this will ever be enough on its own. Sometimes I feel people pass close to the line. Pilots, hikers, children staring too long at the horizon. They pause. They sense me without knowing what they're sensing. Most turn back. A few don't. I adjust. I always do. This is not heroism. It's maintenance. The world continues because someone has to stay where it almost breaks. Someone has to hold the contradiction open without letting it tear wider. There will never be a monument for this. No ending that justifies it. But as long as the days keep arriving in order everywhere else, I remain, holding the line, forever choosing, so no one else has to.